Memoirs, written by Thaddeus Walton from 1965 to 1971. I was born in Woodruff, Rich County, Utah, October 17, 1886. This was the year the large new ranch house was built. The two-room log house east of the new home had been the home for a good many years. Father had added several log rooms adjoining. These buildings had dirt roofs. Boards were placed on log rafters, covered with straw or hay, then covered with clay to make it waterproof. Poles were put along the edge, with pegs driven into the boards in an upright position to hold the poles which held the straw and clay covering. It was on one of these pegs that I saw my younger brother, Paul, hanging by the back of his skirts, head down. At that time, little boys wore skirts until they were at least 4 or 5 years old. I was very much frightened and climbed down and ran for help. I think I was about 5 years old, and this is one of my first remembrances. Other experiences I recall were with our riding ponies. We had a beautiful dark brown horse, high-spirited and named Shep. For safety reasons, we were not permitted to use saddles. So much more fun for Shep, as we traveled down a trail or road at a good fast gallop. He would spot an imaginary object and give a quick jump sideways. The result would mean gathering ourselves off the hard ground after a good shake-up. Sometimes things were pretty black for a few seconds. Shep would wait. I'd climb back on and try it again. As time went by, getting to the store, the post office, to school, gathering the cows from the fields or the hills, was more work for the riding horses. When the cows were grazed in hills, they would often stray away, which meant lots of riding. In bad weather, I would ride my pony to school and turn him loose to go back home. Father and mother were very careful about keeping the family away from contagious diseases. When the school we were attending had an outbreak of smallpox, diphtheria, etc., they would pick up and would change our residence from ranch to Cottonwood or Cottonwood to ranch. This proved to be a very successful solution to our health question. We lived our younger lives without contacting any of these diseases. When high school days came, we had to arrange to live at Cottonwood the entire school season, as Woodruff had no high school at that time. When I was 16 years old, I entered Granite Stake Academy. 2 years later, I enrolled at the LDS High School, and 2 years later, the University of Utah. I quit my university studies 2 years later to engage myself with the ranching business, which lasted a good many years. One of the incidences I remember on the ranch was a time I went to the West Mountains to help tend the sheep. The herd was located on the left fork of the Woodruff Creek, near the Red Rocks. The herder, Al Dixon, was called to attend 2 weeks training with the Utah National Guard at Fort Douglas. I was left there alone, expecting to get help the next day. No one came until the 3rd week. I had no horses to move camp, so the feed was badly grazed, and the sheep insisted on hunting for grass through the nights. I was up through the nights, trying to keep the herd at camp. At this time, I was 12 years old. Finally, Albert arrived back at camp. Being somewhat homesick, I decided to go to the ranch immediately. I traveled all night, on foot, arriving home at daybreak. I was glad to get home and tell Mother about my experiences. Wintertime on the ranch was a more lonely time than summer. Don and I spent a good many years there tending the cattle and horses. The weather was very often 20 to 40 degrees below zero. We had several hundred animals to feed each day, which sometimes meant a lot of snow to shovel, as well as hay. Springtime meant more diversified work. As the grass began to grow, we had to prepare the stock for the summer ranch. For instance, the brands had to be inspected. The young stock that had not been branded had to be branded. Marks for identification of the registered cattle, including ear tags with numbers on or numbers burned on the horns. If they had no horns, we tattooed numbers in their ears. This work all done, we were ready for the trek to the summer ranch. One year I recall we drove the herd hard all day, arriving at the Bear River crossing shortly before dusk. We wanted to cross that night, as the water was already at a dangerously high level and would be higher by morning. We made it across with the cattle, although quite a number of the calves were washed downstream. By searching the riverbanks and using our lariats, we managed to rescue them all. Then came the wagon, following up in the rear. The The water was so deep it partly floated the wagon, but not quite enough to tip it over. When we pulled it out onto the dry land and the water was draining from the wagon bed, we knew what had happened. Bedding, etc., everything was drenched. Our cattle herd was largely composed of purebred, registered stock. A friend of Father's, a wealthy mining man of Salt Lake City, Mr. Thomas Jennings, owned a ranch at Park City, Utah, and this herd of stock. He operated his ranch strictly as a hobby. Father bought his stock and we drove them from Park City to the ranch. It took us 5 days. There was a lot of work and care to keep this herd properly identified, named, and registered. These pedigrees were recorded with the American Shorthorn Breeders Association in Chicago. Father took care of the registering and naming. Life on the ranch in the summertime was much more enjoyable than the winter. The family would all come for the summer. Father always planned lots of entertainment for us, perhaps to help make the work more pleasurable. We took lots of trips to the canyons and always stayed overnight. One time we went to the Badlands in Wyoming and stayed 2 nights at the fossil beds. We dug some beautiful fossils of fish, some as long as 10 inches. One other trip we always planned on was the big trip to Bear Lake. Father would tell us if we could finish the haying by the 10th of August, we could make the trip. We always managed to make it. Our party consisted of approximately 5 or 6 vehicles, wagons, buckboards, light buggies, and saddle horses. Father even had a motorboat, which we took along. The family brass band was the big attraction of our party. The band consisted of around 12 members, including the Snow family, and the invited girlfriends that sang when we played made a very fine musical organization. Lots of Woodruff friends and also Randolph friends joined our party as we journeyed to the lake. At the lake we would give nightly concerts, and the people came from miles around to hear us play. One other time I remember was when I came near to drowning. Don and I were moving some of the cattle to the ranch. The river was quite high and swift. I was riding a new saddle horse, one we had broken in during the winter, and he was giving me a rather hard time. When I was about midstream, he was rearing and trying to buck me off. He hit me in the face with the top of his head, knocked me unconscious, and I went washing downstream. About 100 yards down, I washed onto a sandbar. When I came to, I was lying there with just my head out of the water. I climbed out with boots and chaps full of water, my glasses gone, and my front teeth knocked loose. Otherwise, I guess it was all in a day's work. One experience I remember as being quite humorous. Father leased the Calishaw ranch, some 2,000 acres. It was all fancy with buildings, log house, stables, corrals, 1 round corral for horses. 1 storage shed had a floor with a cellar underneath. This cellar was supposed to be a secret one. We inspected it and found some 50 cattle and horse skins. Some had brands and some didn't. This ranch had been operated by some questionable characters. We didn't know what to do with these skins, so I consulted Sheriff A.C. Call about it. He suggested we go over and look the deal over. He hitched his fancy driving team on the back wagon. It was pretty heavy for them, and we started out. It was a big day's drive. Partway over, we crossed a steep range of mountains, and about halfway up, the hills are barren and the road not visible. The driving team got tired and decided to stop. The sheriff and I got out of the wagon, put rocks back of the wheels, rearranged the harness, and talked nice to them. When Bally reached his head down to get a mouthful of grass, Mr. Call was enraged by this and gave him a big kick in the face. The horse threw his head up, catching Mr. Call's feet in the reins, and stood him completely on his head. The frightened horses started backing down the mountain, the wagon dragging them faster every yard. And I'll bet you could have heard that man screaming and yelling at least a mile away. I was trying hard to help, but couldn't do much. Finally, the wagon cramped, tipped over, and came to a stop. We got Mr. Call untangled, and the wagon righted again, and finally made it up that mountain. The items were hauled in and disposed of by the county authorities. I don't know if any arrests were ever made through the finding of this cache. One time, Will Erickson, who was bishop of the First Ward in Murray, came to the ranch to go hunting. Rue, Paul and I went along. We had one buckboard, 2 horses with saddles, and 1 horse without a saddle. We went over Pinnacle to the summer ranch to hunt. We hunted 1 or 2 days without a sight of game, so Rue and Will took the 2 horses with saddles and decided to hunt alone. I was 11 years old, and Paul was 9. We fooled around camp for a while, but soon tired and decided to go home, which was a big day's trip. We wrote a note with the lead on the head of a bullet. Our horse, Millie, had no saddle and sore feet, so we walked most of the way. Just before sundown, we ran on to some antelope. We ducked down, but one big buck stood with his head high, as if he thought he saw something. I aimed my .30-30 Winchester, and wham! Down he went. The rest took off. We stuck him and let him bleed. We loaded him on Millie, and one of us led, while the other balanced the antelope till we got back to camp. When we arrived at camp, we found nothing but ashes from the bonfire. They had returned, read the note, hitched up the horses to the buckboard, and headed north to the Badlands. We fired a couple of shots into the air so we could have the empty cartridges. We knew that coyotes were afraid of the smell of a gun and did not want the coyotes to bother our game. We then put the empty shells on the antelope and started home again with Millie and her sore feet. It was a dark, miserable trip home, with Paul and I taking turns on the horse. We arrived home at daylight. We were worried about our antelope, so we ate breakfast and got a buckboard with fresh horses and started back. About halfway over to the camp, we met the other 2, Rue and Will, coming home without game. Rue said, "I knew if we left those kids alone, they would find some game." We found our antelope in good condition and loaded him on the buckboard and turned again toward home. It was another hard trip. The buckboard would go down the gully and get stuck. We would work to get it going again, pull it to the top only to run onto another gully. We were glad to get home and were 2 proud kids with our game. One trip, Sim and I were out 3 days and had 1 hard-boiled egg. Sim chose the white and I ate the yolk. One other meal I remember was a sandwich wrapped in plain paper. We never had wax paper at that time. The sandwich was tied on the back of the saddle. As the horse jogged along and was sweating, the sack became wet. When opened, the sandwich was not only wet, but well braced with long black horsehairs. I remember Indians camping on Woodruff Creek when I was 6 years old. They came through in packs of 8 to 10, and had a couple of ponies, dragging poles covered with skins as a rack to haul their belongings. Their ponies were small, and had a light strip from their manes to their tails. This was characteristic of the typical Indian pony. The Indian pony was unlike the Western horse we know. It was a small, light-colored, and sometimes pinto horse with a yellow nose and a yellow ring around each eye. The Indians wore clothes, mostly of tan leather, and the women wore skirts that were very colorful and very full. These materials were usually fabrics that they had received from the whites on a trade. They built fires by the stream and cooked rabbits, squirrels, and food they begged from the ranchers. When they begged, they often waited until the men were away, and then the women would be glad to give them food to get rid of them. I remember a buck with long black hair bringing a squirrel into the campfire that he had just shot. He tossed it into the fire, rolled it in the red coals so it would not burn, and fished it out when he thought it had cooked enough and picked off the meat. These trips were made in spring and fall from Fort Hall to the Cheyenne Reservation. When the weather got bad, they would set up their teepees and wait it out. They were very resourceful and seemed to be able to take care of any situation. One of their favorite campsites was by our old swimming hole. It was called Morgan's Hole, about 1/2 mile from where we lived. One of the most delightful things I remember is the smell of the farm when the pearmain apples were ripe. They had the most elegant odor, and we would store them for winter apples. I remember back when I was quite young, when we rotated from the ranch to the farm. It often took 5 or 6 days. The rain and snow on the dirt roads would present great hardships. We took along milk cows sometimes, furniture, and even an organ, until Father bought one for each place. One time on the way to the ranch, we stopped at Echo. There were about 5 of us, mostly kids. We camped at the head of Echo, near Castle Rock. The next morning, the horses were gone. Charles, the oldest, left to find the horses, and walked 25 miles to the ranch and brought them back. Paul, Lester, Dyke, father, and I waited at the wagon. It was bitter cold. The food on these trips consisted of a pocket of wheat or a sack of potatoes or sometimes a piece of salt bacon. A sage hen was a real treat. One time out, we had a bag of flour in the buckboard, and one of our old horses, named Sorghum, broke it open and ate at it until his head was well covered, as well as the buckboard. Before morning, we had a rainstorm, and morning found us with a terrible white mess. Sometimes when traveling and a storm would hit, we would stay at Reese's or Pace's ranch and sleep on the floor. One of the most difficult problems we had was the lack of waterproof clothing. Day and night we lived in wet clothes. During the bad weather, while living on the ranch, I used to take Ethel on hunting trips near the ranch, sometimes for ducks or Canadian honkers, when we often went on horseback, or for sage chickens, when we would usually go by carriage, or sometimes in our Model T Ford, depending on the terrain that we chose to go. One trip I wish to mention, we went in our carriage buggy. We had our first 2 small tots with us. This trip took us across the Bear River. The route I chose to go was a shortcut road that we used in earlier years as a wood road, and also meant a better route to find game. When I came to the river crossing, Ethel didn't like the looks of it and asked me not to cross. I told her I would take one horse loose from the buggy and ride him across to test it out. As we went out several yards, my horse went into deep water over his head. It came up to my waist as I sat on his back. We struggled around for several minutes and finally made it back to dry ground. I have worried about that trip ever since, as I could easily have drowned my family. One winter on the ranch, it was the year of 1917. The snow was quite deep. So deep, in fact, that when we wanted to go through a fence, we could just travel on the crusted snow and go right over the top of it. The temperature had been 30 degrees below zero for over a week, with a strong wind blowing. Ethel developed an ulcerated tooth and had to have medical care. I hitched Max and Thor on the bobsleigh, put some hay in for a mattress for a bed, tucked her and the 2 little kids in with her, and started for Evanston. No one was attempting to travel this road at this time, excepting the mailman, and he traveled by horseback. The telephone poles were the only guide, and in places they were almost drifted over. We made it in 8 hours, and felt fortunate at that. Ethel had that tooth extracted late that night, which was a real ordeal. Our trip to Yellowstone. It was in 1928, and for years, I had had a yen to visit the national park. We loaded our Dodge car, a car that Ethel's father had given us, with camping equipment, a tent, bedding, cooking equipment, including a gasoline stove and lantern, and eats. Frank Arnold loaded his car the same way, including a rack on the back of his car, which held his much-prized radio that he had just paid $500 for. We then started for the park, a much-cherished trip. Whenever we stopped, Frank was working on that radio, and I believe the best program he ever did get was purely static. We learned later that radio reception in that mountainous country was practically nil. We stopped overnight at Moran, a beautiful resort on the east shore of Jackson Lake, at the spillway and head of Snake River. The gigantic mountain Moran is directly to the west. The fishing was great, and we caught all the trout we could use. Our next night was at West Thumb on the shore of Yellowstone Lake. There are a large number of hot pots with their boiling water near the lake shore, and a fisherman can stand there, catch a fish, swing around, duck him in the hot pot, and have a nicely cooked fish before he is taken off the hook. West Thumb also has some cabins, a curio shop, and a variety of commodities, a filling station, a public campground, and, oh yes, let's not forget the bears, lots of them, black and brown. We made camp on the campground and proceeded to cook dinner when we heard some loud screaming down below us. A big brown was running up through the camp with a ham he had helped himself to. He sat down not far from us and proceeded to devour it. All through the night they bothered us getting into our grub boxes and running into our tent ropes. It wasn't much of a night for sleep. Next morning we learned a bear had entered the store and had gotten frightened when they tried to drive him out. He climbed the walls that were filled with shelves and merchandise, tearing everything to the floor. The glass showcases that were filled with curios, jewelry, and notions were tipped over and broken. June 20th, 1912, was a very important time in my life. I was married to Ethel M. Arnold, daughter of Judge and Mrs. John R. Arnold of Evanston, Wyoming. Ethel's parents gave us a big wedding reception at Evanston, and it still is a very memorable occasion to me. The reception was held at 8 a.m., so as to enable us to take the noon train to Salt Lake. Lester met us at the train and escorted us to our home in Cottonwood. Mother and father, with the aid of Dyke and Dell, gave us another reception, which was held at Dyke and Dell's home on Simpson Avenue. It was a grand reception, of which we have fond remembrances. After our honeymooning in Salt Lake, we went by car to the ranch, arriving there at the busy haying season. Our trip to the ranch took us by way of Ogden, where we spent 2 enjoyable days with Ethel's friends, the Jack Burks. From Ogden, we went to Evanston, Ethel's hometown, and then on to the ranch. We moved into the ranch home that Don and I were buying from A.C. Call. It took a lot of fixing up, but with the help of Don, we made it quite livable. It was a different life for Ethel, but she loved the animals, horses, cows, sheep, chickens, etc. She became a real horse lady and did a lot of riding. Prince and Cowboy were her favorite ponies. She also became a mighty fine cook. Ethel soon made a lot of lifelong friends in Woodruff. The town of Woodruff depended on us Waltons to furnish music for their entertainment, including their dances. After our little ones started showing up, it became quite a problem, but Ethel would bundle them up and take them along. Genevieve was our first one and a go-getter. Never a dull moment. John was next, was quite a sober boy, having lots of earaches. Evelyn was a husky and always a happy child. We had some hard winters on the ranch, lots of cold weather. Louise was born in October. She got pneumonia when she was 3 months old. And for 16 days and nights, the town people came to help us take care of her, staying days and some nights. The nearest doctor was Dr. Ray, 12 miles away. With 3 feet of snow on the ground, it took about 4 hours to make the trip one way. In 1923, we left the ranch and moved to Salt Lake City. We bought a brick duplex that was built and owned by Ethel's grandfather, the Reverend F.L. Arnold, pastor of the Westminster Church. His neighbors and congregations all loved him and donated funds to have a beautiful leaded window installed in the First Presbyterian Church at B Street and South Temple. The window is still there. In April 1923, I started my employment with the Standard Oil Company, known then as the Utah Oil Refinery. Ethel's brother, F.L. Arnold, was assistant superintendent of the plant and directed my efforts considerably in learning the oil business. I worked for 30 years in the manufacturing department and was a refinery stillman for about 25 years. In 1954, we bought a new home on the East Bench, leaving the old home that we had spent a lot of happy and busy years at. During our years spent at the old home, we belonged to a number of clubs, church clubs, card clubs, and refinery personnel clubs. Ethel also found time to work at the Utah Hotel, Newhouse Hotel, and Kearns Building. She ran the stands that sold jewelry, magazines, papers, cigars, and tobacco. She was a fine sales lady. At one check the company made, they found she had sold more jewelry than the 4 other sales ladies put together. As time marched on, 2 of us going to work, by the way working different hours, found with the children going to school, different schools, we were a very busy family. Music was also an important study and pleasure in our home. It was a regular routine, with private teachers and also school orchestras and singing clubs. My brother dropped in at our house often, and we would have orchestra practice. I always kept a good library of the finest music. Father trained me to do that. I was retired in 1952 from my work at the Standard Oil. I talked Ethel into quitting her work several years later, so now we could start following our married kids to different parts of the country. Vive, Evie, and families lived in Delaware. We went there a good many times, visiting all of the Atlantic states from Florida to Maine. We visited Father's old home in Portland, the World's Fair in New York, and spent a lot of time in Boston with Evie and Bob and the Crows. Living at Iowa Street with the work we had to do and children going to school, time flitted along pretty fast. We found rather suddenly that our family was growing to adulthood, and were even starting to get married. Genevieve was married to Wilbert L. Gore in 1935, and we gave them a reception at the First Presbyterian Church. They lived in several states, finally building them a wonderful home in Newark, Delaware. John and Ruth Lund were married in Utah. Evelyn and Robert D. Urquhart were married in Colorado. And Louise and Robert Cushman were married in Nevada. As a result of these marriages, we have a wonderful bunch of grandsons and granddaughters.